here, and thanks everyone for coming out on such a terrible day. But in any event, in terms of the course, I'll just speak for about 15 minutes.
Sure.
Even though Raphael knows I can talk for hours. But the course that I do at Rotman in Islamic finance, it's about 40 students, and only 5 are Muslim. The rest of them are from sort of different faiths. It's not a course in religion, it's a course what we call in structured finance. The motivation for that is that Canada's a melting pot where people are able to pursue their faith, and when it comes to financing, the idea is that we can create structures that are consistent with the Canadian legal system. It allows people to pursue their faith. And one thing I'll say about that, in the UK, which has the best developed Sharia compliant financial system in the West, 40% of people that have mortgages that are Sharia compliant are not Muslims. So that's kind of the point. But in any event, what I want to talk about today has to do with work I've done with the World Bank. So as you know, the client countries of the World Bank are the poor to developing countries, and I'll get my slides up soon.
Yeah.
Okay, we're working on it.
Keep stalling.
But I've traveled extensively with the World Bank to many countries, and a question for the room, and I apologize for asking this question, but I think it's important. When you see the poverty in the video, how many people in this room have been to those communities and interacted with people there? Okay, so it's a good number, and the one story I want to tell is think about the Rotman School. So a little plug for the program, but you know how much the MBA program cost? You guys know? It's $110,000. You paid it off already, right? Okay. But why do I say that is the people that we attract are a particular demographic. Let me just say it that way there. I took the students to India on a study tour. So every year we have 3 or 4 study tours where we take students to different parts of the world. And if you saw the movie Slumdog Millionaire, and where the Ravi, the slum, we went there, and they warned us about the poverty that we would see, and I put Kleenex, and I've been to a lot of countries, but based on how they explained it, I put Kleenex in my pocket because I anticipated I would cry. I can't explain to students and how they broke down. It was quite remarkable the impact they had, but particularly one woman from an established family went into this slum, and she was trying to compose herself, and then she saw a little boy playing with chemicals with his hands. And she started to cry uncontrollably, and she said, I saw my little brother in that little boy's eyes. And it was really moving. And when we left the slums, we were on the bus going to our next visit, and a student from a developing country, a student from China, didn't yell at us, but yelled to us, and was so angry. And I think that's kind of important for what I want to say. Do I have? Okay, so I'll just do that here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, and so, when you think, and this was mentioned in the video about, property rights and institutions, and what's amazing about Canada is we're a G7 country with all of these great things about us, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But, the fact that there are about 400 million children and 400 million adults, about 800 million people in the world that live under $1 a day. I mean, the poverty is unbelievable around the world, and as we know, the United Nations has their Sustainable Development Goals, which say by the year 2030, they want to eliminate extreme poverty. Actually, when you read the documentations, it's to reduce it to 3%. It'd be hard to get rid of it all, but there's just a tremendous amount of poverty. What does this graph show? If you look at the experience of the world, and there's a lot of people that criticize multinationals and globalization and that kind of stuff, but if you think about what globalization has done, and it fits perfectly with that video, it's not about giving people aid, it's about giving people economic opportunity, the environment to provide for themselves and for their families. You have a place like China. It's unbelievable that 300-400 million people taking out of extreme poverty. Places like India. The poorest place, I want to just ask someone, what's the poorest country you've ever visited? Or it's totally heartbreaking? Someone?
Yeah, Peru.
Peru. Okay, Peru. For me, it was Bolivia. It's unbelievable, the poverty. And the idea is that no one wants to see their children in that environment. Aid is helpful, I believe, only in times of disaster, but that's not the answer over time. What this graph shows, and this is what the World Bank uses in its approach to development, is that the way to reduce poverty is through economic growth. Countries that grow more rapidly raise, and who said it? A rising tide raises all boats. That was Kennedy, right? That was really my saying, but he took it. Okay? And what this also shows is that, and this is the focus of what we want to talk about, is the issue around infrastructure. And really, when you think about institutions, there's what we call hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. And the video really focused on what we call soft infrastructure, like institutions. But this is hard infrastructure, and really what it shows is that across the whole world, the countries that have better infrastructure are better off. The people are better off, they're more prosperous, there's lower poverty. And this is correlation. But here's the idea, is that it basically says that those measures of infrastructure that most relate to prosperity are things like electricity, communications, transportation, ports, and the ability to trade with the global economy and so on. But all of this to say there's just an enormous amount of evidence that what drives prosperity in countries. In the video, they talked about soft infrastructure, rule of law, property rights, institutions. Here it's a bit of focus on physical infrastructure. And this person here, so any of you who have done an undergraduate strategy course, you'll know the name Michael Porter. You know Michael Porter. I think he's your buddy, right? Well, Michael Porter sort of is the father of strategy, a Harvard professor, Porter's Diamond, Porter's Five Forces. This is sort of the heart of strategy, Michael Porter. He came to Rotman, and he actually gave a talk, and he was actually preaching, like you would see in a religious institution, about we have to celebrate that we are capitalists. But what he said and what resonated with me, and it's also reflected in the video, he said it, there's just not enough money in the whole world to help the world's poor. There just isn't. If you take the richest people in the world and you start using their money to feed the poor, that money would run out within a year. There's just not enough money because there's 2 billion people that are poor. And that's why we must engage the private sector in creative ways. We must mobilize private capital in order to enable the poor to be able to take themselves out of poverty. And that's the work I've done with the World Bank. What I've done with the World Bank is help the World Bank develop structures and approaches that would allow global capital to move into a developing country environment where there are poor people, and allow poor people the ability to undertake business activity and to prosper. Okay? And the evidence shows it's working very, very well. So now when you look at this, it's really hard to see, and I apologize, but the idea is that once a country or a community gets to a critical level of development, then it's self-sustaining. This is the work by this guy named Robert Solow, and the Solow growth model. He won the Nobel Prize for this in 1972, I guess it was. But he shows that we have to allow the poor, these poor environments, to get to a critical level. And once they get to that critical level of development, they're then able to perpetuate the economic growth and prosperity for them. And it requires both hard and soft infrastructure. The soft infrastructure is the property rights, the rule of law, how easy it is to open a business, and so on and so on. And you know, I just have to decide one thing that, as an academic, as a professor, as someone who's traveled to a lot of countries, infuriates me more than anything is corruption. And when you think about a country, I'll say the country is not, there's 100 I can pick on, but I'll pick on Brazil tonight. You think about a country like Brazil, one of the BRIC economies, growing at double-digit rates, doing incredibly well, 200 million people, and because the establishment wants to enrich themselves, they create a political crisis, but they really undermine all of the growth, all of the confidence in the economy, and as a result, a lot of the capital that was coming flees, because it's a big world out there, and when you have global capital, they're going to go to where they're able to do business, not having to deal with these kinds of issues. So what ends up happening, because the ruling class, I'll call it 1 million people, wants to line their pockets, they ruin it for 200 million people. And the story is repeated over and over and over again. And that's why when it comes to corruption, that's the thing that bothers me the most of everything. And I would put that into what we call soft infrastructure. And so, you know, I'm writing a book, it's at UT Press right now, and they're asking for more revisions. If the reviewer of my book's in this room, please be gentle, okay? But just think about Canada. And so this comes from a trip I had for the World Bank, and we went to 3 countries in Asia, and we saw some very poor, it's heartbreaking when you see the poverty, it really is. And we, forgive me for saying this, but I get into a plane and I get into business class, and they treat you like a king, and it's like fantastic. And I land at Pearson Airport, and you think about Canada, and you say, wow, we're the 17th largest economy, it's a $2 trillion economy, income per person is about $60,000, we're wealthy, we're inclusive, we're diverse, we're tolerant, we're safe. Top 10 for math in the world for math scores. Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver are listed as the top 25 cities in the world to live in. Someone complained because Calgary's not on there. Look, and you think about it, and you come to Canada and you say, wow, aren't we lucky? Like seriously, landed, I got into a car, went to my house, nice neighborhood, we're beautiful neighbors, tolerant, unbelievable. And then you start to think about Canada's Indigenous communities. And it's unbelievably, it's a national tragedy, it really is. When you think about inside Canada, one of the best countries in the world to live in. And there's 2 million self-identified Indigenous Canadians. The average income is about 1/2 of that of the average. I think that's an overestimate because the poverty. And the next question I'm going to ask is how many people in this room have actually been to an Indigenous community? There's very few. And that's why at the Rotman School, one of the things we're in the process of doing, and we've talked about it as well, is about getting MBA students and the students from the Monk School, you know, people that come from fantastic communities in Canada and globally. A lot of them get jobs in downtown Toronto, and their 2 years at Rotman or Monk or whatever, they see nothing about Canada's history, about Indigenous Canadians, about the state of Indigenous communities, which is incredibly sad. So one of the things we're trying to build at the Rotman School is an outreach program where MBA students and Monk students would go spend a week at Indigenous communities across the country. And do I see Sarah here? Where's Sarah? Okay, and Sarah's going to lead that effort for us at the Rotman School, where basically the last thing we want to do is take a student from Forest Hill and send him or her to an Indigenous community, because then they'll ask, you know, where's the air conditioning and so on. So there has to be work done for that. But, you know, put the charity aside. Okay, just think about people saying, let's help Indigenous communities because of all of the injustices they felt, all of the history. Put all of that aside. The economic case is unbelievably strong. Does anybody know how many people immigrate to Canada every year? Roughly.
300,000.
Yeah, 300,000. And now I'm going to ask a math question. You take 300,000 and divide by 365. Divide by 24. Can anyone give me roughly that number?
2, 3.
No. Do it. Can someone pull up their phone? 300,000. We're waiting for you. Okay. 300. What you got?
34, around 35.
35. So what is that number? 35. That means in Canada, every hour, 35 people arrive.
Oh, okay.
Every hour. Every hour, there's 35 people arriving in Canada to make Canada their new home. And you think about all of the evidence on immigration, it creates economic opportunity. Yet at the same time, there's 2 million self-identified Indigenous Canadians that are not part, I shouldn't say that, Sarah knows this better than I, there's many, many Indigenous Canadians that are benefiting from Canadian prosperity, but there's a lot that's not. And unfortunately, we, to put the charity aside, just from an economic perspective, empowering these communities to achieve their potential would allow Canada to achieve its potential, but also erase this wrong that was done to these communities in the past. So if this would raise Canada's prosperity on the order of $50 billion, that means every year there'd be $50 billion of additional economic activity if Indigenous communities were allowed to participate in the Canadian dream to the same extent that all other Canadians are allowed to do that. So Indigenous communities would be empowered, economic reconciliation would be promoted, and this national tragedy would be corrected. Now, I think this is the part that is the most important. And this is the part that I think very few Canadians understand, and it's the systemic discrimination in policy that limits the ability of Indigenous Canadians from participating. Think about a municipality. So if you go to London, Ontario, beautiful city, you can go 4 kilometers west and there's an Indigenous community. And look at the difference, it's unbelievable if you go there and see. You look at a municipality that has property rights, so everybody owns their land, and the government can tax it, so they get property taxes, so they have a tax base to operate the city. But furthermore, the municipality can issue a bond, municipal bonds, that are backed by the province in order to build all of the infrastructure that they need. Roads, bridges, electricity, all of the stuff that makes our cities great. And then you look at the Indigenous community, they don't have property rights. People don't own the land. In the few cases where there's been experiments, it's not been a good outcome. There's no tax base and hence no recurring tax revenue. So the Indigenous community doesn't have a recurring tax revenue, unlike a municipality. And furthermore, the federal legislation, the federal government states explicitly that if an Indigenous community issues a bond, they will not back it. They will not back it. So we have a proposal, which we've structured, and I should say this is done with my close friend David Robinson, who is in Calgary. Unfortunately, he's not here with us today, where we're able to create a structure so that this Indigenous community would look just like a city. That's all we ask for. This will cost the Canadian government nothing. Zero. It would only require that the government change some legislation that would allow Indigenous communities to issue bonds, essentially, but that they would be able to raise capital. And what would the revenue be? It would be the revenue from the underlying infrastructure that would pass through their communities. So I don't want to go through this here because it's kind of technical and we have a picture, but essentially what we propose is the following. And again, this is a structure, it's complicated, and I don't want to go through it on, what day is it? Wednesday. On a Wednesday night with a snowstorm, okay? But the idea is that governments, and this was the point of the op-ed I wrote that Jim read and reached out to me, it's time for the federal government to stop thinking that Indigenous communities can be dealt with after the deal is done. Too often the federal government simply gets up, makes a deal on a pipeline or something that affects Indigenous communities, and simply thinks those Indigenous communities are going to sign on afterwards. It's time that they be treated equally as an equal stakeholder, and then with the structure that we have developed, we're able to create an environment where capital can flow into these communities, but not affect the integrity of the ownership of the land by that community. What the investors would be getting in return would be a share of the revenue that the infrastructure projects that go through their communities, the revenue that's generated. So there's an infrastructure project like the pipeline that goes through an Indigenous community. The Indigenous community would share in the revenues generated from that project, and those revenues would be the source of the recurring tax base that would allow the Indigenous community to look very much like the municipality. And I think with that, I'll stop. Is that okay?
That's great.
Okay, thank you. And any questions or?
We'll have questions afterwards. Thank you, Wally.